one of the people in the seminar had this sort of statement they made that what some people call courageous is what other people call normal. And there's a few aspects of that I want to unpack. One is around the muscle of courage, because courage is actually a muscle. Things that you were scared of initially, you become less scared of, but also you can develop this ability to just be less scared of everything. And so there's something about how you relate to fear itself, but initially it can be very targeted. So I know that when some of you may know, I think those of you who will come to CSL Celebrate, but I have a different side of me, which is a singer-songwriter, although it's not able to be very active right now. And when I first got on the stage to perform in a sort of more solo artist capacity, I was literally shaking and it was extremely terrifying. But then over time, I just desensitized to it. And actually, when I launched the business, there was something, I did a performance around the same time that I did my first public speech, around the same time. I did a number of things that were all about facing that fear. And so it then became not about one thing, it became a generalized thing. And that's why I did it, because I knew that starting a business in the middle of a recession with no one else who really understood what I was talking about was very, very scary. So there's this generalized muscle of courage. I think, Nora, your story demonstrated it, Marvin's story demonstrated, he actually sort of broke down, as Elias said, that process of noticing that I'm having these thoughts, that I've been here before, I've faced them, I can do this too. And so, and that set of thoughts doesn't have to be specific to the thing. It's also just the experience of fear itself. So the muscle of courage is the first thing that I want to put on the table for yourself, but also for you to think about people around you and where they are in their relationship with fear and feeling empowered. And sometimes you can mistake power for courage. It's not. Being able to be powerful and operate within a system and seem to be fine and be able to do things that look courageous doesn't mean you're actually courageous. It means you've been given permission to do those things. Sometimes it's a lot more courageous for someone who does a fraction of the same thing that that other person who was powerful did, but they weren't given permission to do it. So for an example, and it's less of an issue now, but when I started off as an entrepreneur, as a woman, as someone who looked a bit younger than people were expecting, as an ethnic minority, when I got around certain tables, people weren't expecting me to speak up. And because I felt the weight of people not expecting me to have voice, it took more courage for me to speak than it did for someone else around that table who people looked at and automatically turned to. What they were doing wasn't courage, what I was doing was. Just being in that room and existing took some courage. And so it's important to think about that. And that brings me to the next theme, which is the inequality of courage, or the courage imbalance. And I think this is really interesting to reflect on. I'm going to offer two versions of it. One is the power aspect. So when there's different power levels, different levels of courage might be required for the same thing. And it's very important to note that, because you can give credit to two people for being courageous and they're actually, it's a completely different act. But also there's what I would call required courage versus discretionary courage, which is a little bit of a flip of it almost, because when you're someone with a disability, you know, my roommate when I went to university, and I went on my own journey of facing my biases around it, but she was in a wheelchair. She was a small person. She was full of energy. She was much more fun than I was, frankly, but I wasn't expecting that. But for her to go to dinner took courage. Because for her to go to dinner, she has to get on her wheelchair. She has to go into the dining room. She's relying on someone to be there to get her tray, to put stuff on it. She's showing up in an environment where she may or may not be accepted. She's going to see some people who don't know her, who are going to look at her funny. And she's going to have to process all of that and face all sorts of uncertainty about having dinner, whereas I just go to dinner. And so that courage is required because she has to eat. So there's a requirement of courage. When there are things that are part of your job and everyone's expecting you to do that, there's a requirement for courage. But sometimes when you're the underdog, when I was going to those meetings where it took more courage for me, I had to, because I was committed to my business and I was committed to a certain future. But sometimes courage is discretionary, which means you don't actually have to do anything. And sometimes because you have the luxury of being in privilege, but sometimes because you actually, it's not your goal, it's someone else's goal. And when courage is discretionary, it's different because you sometimes, it can be equally, sometimes more courageous because you have something to lose. You don't have to do anything, but you have something to lose. So someone around that table actually saying, I'm sorry, she was talking. That's discretionary courage. And frankly, as I've told Nora, I've sort of been repeating it to her recently because I don't know if she realized, but when I met Nora, we were sitting around a table. I had just joined an advisory board, which was a big deal, an interesting new experience for me. And people were just talking over me, and Nora was the one running it. And she sort of was like, excuse me, I want to hear from her. And that might have been an automatic reaction for her, but that's something that it wasn't a requirement for her. And that's the sort of thing that's discretionary courage. And sometimes those discretionary acts will actually be more ones that create more fear because you're putting yourself on the line for someone else, for something you believe in, you're going out of your way. But discretionary courage is very important because if you think about a legal system, or if you think about a healthy, high-performing team, one is structural, one is cultural, but in both cases, what you're doing is you're making it so that what's discretionary just becomes normal. If you think about someone who's physically strong and someone who's physically weaker, the strong person takes something from the weaker person. It takes a lot of courage for the weaker person to challenge that. It doesn't take much courage for the strong person to take it. In a world where there's strong laws and there's a legal system, it all of a sudden takes courage for the strong person to take something from the weak person. And all of a sudden it might not take so much courage for the weak person to challenge it. If you take that to what's happening in terms of police, Black Lives Matter, some of the incidents to challenge right now, I mean, why should everyone be celebrating because the verdict went the way it was? It's because of something not working in terms of that discretionary versus required level of courage. So the legal system is meant to actually create a balance so that what's discretionary is just sort of normal when it's in relation to fairness. But leaders also create that balance because you're creating the system where the people on your team feel that it's their responsibility to check in with each other. It's something that, they sort of is part of the values. It doesn't have to be because they're scared of the consequences. It can be because that's just the culture. So actually balancing out that power, that courage and balance is the second thing I want you to think of. The third thing is relates to the mindful exclusion report. We talk about 3 areas in relation to fear. You can think about it, 3 areas of staying in your norm versus going out. One is the fear of disruption. Are you scared to be disrupted? It's the reason why people don't engage with unfamiliar things until it's too late because they don't want to be disrupted. They're sort of just doing their thing. The norm is working for them. COVID disrupted everyone. So, that sort of the people who had the courage to actively disrupt themselves were in a better place for COVID. And we have the data to show it, which is really exciting. In terms of rejection, the fear of rejection, that's the second one. People don't want to sort of be alienated from their group, especially if it's something that's discretionary. But the people who are willing to say the thing that's on everyone's mind or to challenge the thing and risk rejection often have healthier relationships. That's key for psychological safety. And thirdly, the fear of losing status. And you see a lot of leaders clinging on to power instead of what they're meant to be doing, instead of service. And that is a classic leadership problem that you see politically, but it takes many forms when people are in leadership positions purely because they want the power or just they lose track of the reason, the purpose that they're serving. And so purpose is the antidote to that. So 3 types of fear that come in. And the final thing I'll put on the table is what I call the courage ROI. And that's where, okay, so I feel like I have the muscle of courage. I feel like I want to sort of look at where there's courage imbalances so that we're all courageous together, or we're creating an environment of team. We're plugged into each other. And I'm aware of these different types of fear. So I'm aware of them in myself, which involves a level of mindfulness. But actually, if I'm courageous about that, can I even do anything? What if I do that and I put myself on the line and nothing happens? And this is a strategic decision because sometimes you can do something that is a lot of effort and very little return. And other times you do something that's no effort and a big return. So the stuff that's no effort and a big return, but is aligned with your values, then please just do. And that takes mindfulness. But the stuff that is a little bit more effort and will there be return? There's a quote that I saw posted on LinkedIn today, which is actually a great quote in general, James Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And I just think it's such a powerful quote, because right now there's discretionary stuff that we can turn our heads from, or we can face. And frankly, we can't face everything. None of us here can handle everything. If you just think of climate change, everyone is somewhat constrained by the system that we operate in, where we have to go to the store and we have to get food, but you can deviate in certain ways, but not every way. So this courage ROI is partly about deciding, okay, there's some things where I'm not sure what the impact is going to be, but I'm just deciding this is me. This is the dance of how I do courage. It may have an impact, it may not, but I'm still going to challenge it, or I'm still going to speak up about it. And if I lose, then I lose, because this is who I am. And so you being able to identify what are the things that are so core to me as an individual, or as a leader, what are the things that are so core to my purpose and the purpose of our organization, that we have to be consistently courageous on this one thing, because this is about the integrity of who we are. And that's something that I think can help as you're being strategic about, I may or may not win if I do this. What are the things that you're going to do even if you lose? And that's how people know that you're real about it.